So welcome to the Bible Lounge. Today we're taking a little look at reading the Bible in its historical context. So we'll jump straight in with an example there in Romans chapter 16, verse 16. We have this example here where it says, "Greet one another with a holy kiss." So today you probably don't see a lot of people greeting each other in church by kissing each other. In some parts of the world you do. But how are we meant to understand this? This was written in the first century, so nearly 2,000 years ago. And the Apostle Paul, who wrote this, is the historical writer, the Apostle Paul. He wrote this and he commanded as an apostle with apostolic authority, being commissioned by Jesus himself, he commanded the Roman Christians to greet one another with a holy kiss. Kissing was a way of showing affection in the time, and what we're meant to draw from it is the idea that Christians should have a greater love or affection for one another than they would for just every person in the world. Okay, so there's a brotherly or sisterly love that Christians have for one another. So how we're meant to interpret that then is perhaps today to greet one another with a hearty handshake or maybe a hug. It depends on your context, but the idea is to show your great affection in your greeting. I think there's something fairly intimate, and don't read that wrong in any sense, but something intimate about a holy kiss, and in certain cultures that's certainly appropriate. A hearty handshake, maybe instead of just a standard one-handed quick handshake, you might do a two-handed firm grip or with a bit of a hug or something, but you show great affection. So the idea is to work out what is the historical context, which in this case was greeting with kissing, and what is the principle underlying it. So what are the timeless principles underlying it that we're trying to work out? And the underlying principle is greet one another with a great show of love and affection. So then you jump the bridge into the future, and the way that we show that love and affection might be through a hearty handshake or a hug. So that's what we mean by reading in its historical context. So there's a few cautions as well. One caution here is when we get our historical information, we have to be careful to get it primarily from the Bible. Other sources of history are not wrong to get. Archaeology and historical books like Josephus the historian, Tacitus and others, that's fine. But we do have to be careful with our context and make sure that the historical information that we read doesn't undermine Scripture, because Scripture is the primary authority. The example we've got here in Matthew chapter 14 is Jesus walking on the sea. Okay, that's clearly a miracle, clearly a miraculous thing. So if you read historical context, history would interpret that and say there's no way he could have been walking because you don't believe in the supernatural. So maybe there was an ice flow or something like that. We can look through all the layers of ice and work out there was a particularly cold era that might have been around the first century when Jesus was around. So maybe he was walking on ice on the sea. And that historical information undoes the intent of Scripture, which is to show that Jesus, as the Son of God, has power over the elements. So we've got to be careful about that. There are some more serious situations too, where you can undermine what it means to be saved by faith alone, by trying to turn faith into works. That's a big caution to be careful of. And some have said that the Jewish works culture was actually a sign of faith, and they twisted around in it. That's more complicated than we have time for here now. Just be careful about that historical information and how it causes you to reinterpret Scripture. You should be able to read the whole of Scripture and get a sense of the main thrust, and then your historical information that you read may shed a little bit further light on that, but it's not going to change it to mean the opposite. Another example here, Matthew chapter 27. So you might have heard the theory from early Judaism that said that Jesus had his body stolen. Okay, so that was an early theory sent to discredit the resurrection. And we have here an account where in Matthew chapter 27, we have guards going to Pilate. Okay, so in fact, it's the priests and the Pharisees gathering before Pilate, who was in charge of the region, and they said to him, "We don't want this claim that he will rise again to be, true." They wanted to make sure people weren't going to steal the body, basically. And Pilate responded to their request to make the tomb secure, in case they go and steal his body and say he's risen from the dead. Pilate says to them, "Go ahead and do it. Make it as secure as you can." And so they did that. But we know the stone was rolled away anyway. And Jesus, I'm trying to draw a bit of a tomb here for you. Jesus was not there. And in fact, he appeared in his resurrected form to many people, to 500, more than 500 at one time, according to 1 Corinthians 15. So do we believe Scripture, or do we believe that theory from historical Judaism? Well, Scripture makes it really clear that there was a solid guard there to prevent this very claim from taking place. So Jesus did in fact rise from the dead. There are a few other challenges. So sometimes people hold on to what is historical. So if you sort of hold on to historical practices, if you hold on to historical practices that are not intended to be timeless in Scripture, then you're going to end up with some very weird customs. For instance, if you insist on celebrating the Lord's Supper exactly the same way, sitting down on the floor, using cushions, maybe, and you say that's how Jesus and his disciples celebrated the supper when Jesus instituted the supper, so that's what we have to do, you're going to end up in some weird places, okay? And you're going to insist that people have to do things that Scripture does not command them to do. Another situation is where sometimes we dismiss practices as historical. Okay, give you an example. This might be a bit of an annoying example for some of you, but in 2 Timothy it says women shouldn't teach or have authority over men. Okay, and people say, well, that was just a historical practice, so we don't need to worry about that anymore. The problem is that it's not just a historical practice, because the very verse following refers you to Adam and Eve. It doesn't say because this is our historical practice, it says because Adam and Eve. And you can read that yourself. I think it's 1 Timothy chapter 2. So you can find that out. When you're reading Scripture in context, you'll be able to see pretty clearly if it's a historical practice, because usually it won't be referred to a number of times in different places, and it won't fit with the whole flow of Scripture very well. Or you'll be able to tell if it is a timeless principle, because it'll usually refer to truths that are timeless, like that Adam was made first, and Eve was made from him as the helper. Yeah, that's a bigger discussion as well, so there'll be another video for that at some point, no doubt. Recapping very quickly, go back to the start. When you're reading the Bible, you need to read it in its historical context. You think about what's unique for that historical period, what are the timeless principles that you can take out, and then apply them to the future, for example, the hearty handshake or a hug instead of a holy kiss. And be cautious to take your authoritative history from the Bible. Hopefully that's helpful for you. God bless.